I want to say hello to everybody and thank you for joining us today. My name is John Quigley. I'm the Assistant Dean for Advancement for the College of Arts and Sciences at SU. The format for today's presentation is for Professor Hier to present for around 15 minutes, at which time we will then open things up for your questions. At that time, you'll be able to submit your questions via the chat and I will read them. Or you can ask your question directly using the raise hand function. And I ask that you please hold all of your questions until Professor Hier is done with her presentation. Right now I want to introduce Professor Bridget Hier. She is a new member of our highly regarded psychology department, and she's a rising star in her field. Professor Hier, who joined our faculty last year, specializes in academic intervention for children with or at risk for learning disabilities. Her research focuses on developing effective, efficient instructional practices to improve children's academic outcomes, including how to foster lasting improvements in children's writing skills. Professor Hier earned an early career award from the Society for the Study of School Psychology and held a postdoctoral fellowship from the Devereux Center for Effective Schools, which serves children with and at risk for developing emotional and behavioral disorders within public schools and other child-serving institutions. So without further ado, let me please welcome today's presenter, Professor Bridget Hier.
So I want to thank John for that introduction. I also want to say thank you to all of you fellow alumni who have joined us today. I am also an SU alum. I grew up on Otisco Lake, which is just south of Syracuse. It's the smallest finger lake, and due to the weather, I decided to complete my undergraduate degree down in North Carolina. I went to NC State University before coming back up to Syracuse to complete my graduate work. After I completed my graduate training, I worked for a nonprofit organization, as John mentioned, the Center for Effective Schools, where I worked with dozens of school districts within the Philadelphia area and surrounding states. Following that, I took a faculty position at a different university where I was for several years before coming back to Syracuse, where I hope to stay again for a long time now. So John mentioned that I work in the Department of Psychology. The Department of Psychology has 4 areas associated with it. I'm affiliated with our school psychology program. We have a PhD program where we engage in a lot of community involvement, both through faculty research. So through our faculty research, we conduct a variety of studies in several different school districts throughout the area. In addition, our PhD students provide clinical services to children, their parents, and teachers in the area as well through a variety of organizations. In terms of my research, I currently have 3 graduate students and 6 undergraduate research assistants who work with me on my research team. And as John mentioned, my research broadly focuses on how academic and behavioral skills develop. And within that frame of development, what are effective practices that we can use to improve skill development, which I'm happy to talk more about later if anybody has any questions. So today we're going to be talking about education in the era of COVID, and I know that folks have a lot of passionate opinions on that topic, which is certainly understandable. So I find that it's helpful to set some expectations around what I will be discussing based on my areas of expertise and what I do not have expertise in. So what I will be discussing today is the research surrounding in-person versus remote or distance education. I'll also be talking about the impact of educational instability on this generation of students. And then finally, I'll be talking about some strategies that are evidence-based that can be used to help support student learning during this time. Now, I do not have any expertise in research on public health. I also don't have any expertise on educational policy making. And so because of that, I will not be discussing any political opinions, and I also won't be making any policy recommendations. Okay, so the reason that this is such a hot topic is because schools perform so many functions for kids. They help support students' academic, behavioral, and social emotional development. They also perform some really important services in terms of supporting health and nutrition, and all of those services are currently being disrupted right now. We have 56 million students in the United States who are currently experiencing some type of shift in their educational stability. They're engaging and learning in a variety of different platforms. Even students who will be attending in-person learning in the fall may be experiencing some shifts in the effectiveness of that in-person learning for a variety of reasons. But one of those reasons is that really what we're seeing right now is this mass exodus of experienced teachers leaving the field. So likely, again, due to anxiety around returning to the classroom in this era of COVID-19. So back in July, 39% of teachers in Michigan reported to the Michigan Education Association that they were either contemplating retirement or that they would definitely be retiring. And then based on national polling, 18% of respondents reported, again, nationwide, that they definitely would not be returning to the classroom. And this has resulted in states granting emergency certifications to individuals who have no teaching experience. So this, of course, raises then questions regarding the quality and effectiveness of in-person learning this year compared to prior years. In addition, many students will be participating in distance learning or remote learning. And so if we think about what are the variables that are necessary for distance learning or remote learning to work or to be effective, there are several of them. Two that we hear a lot about are needing a reliable internet connection and access to a computer. And those are certainly very important variables, of course. But I worry that we only focus on those at the expense of thinking about some other logistics as well. And so one of those important logistics is technology literacy. So even if we provide individuals who don't have access to reliable internet or computer, even if we provide those to those individuals, it's likely that they may not necessarily have the technology literacy needed to appropriately engage, or I should say effectively engage in distance or remote learning. So when I say technology literacy, I'm meaning things like, for example, knowing how to troubleshoot if your Wi-Fi goes down, or knowing how to work certain programs on your computer that are needed for distance or remote learning. So I just worry that when we focus so much on providing internet access and computers, in the absence of thinking about ensuring that those individuals are supported in terms of their technology literacy, that may not be the most effective practice. In addition, many teachers simply haven't been trained in how to provide effective distance or remote learning. So that's a challenge as well. In addition, many teachers also may experience challenges with technology literacy too. So let's say that all four of those then are in place: reliable internet, computer, technology literacy, and teachers who have been trained in distance or remote learning and are effective at carrying that out. If all of those are in place, that still may all be for naught if we don't have effective active supervision of students to actively ensure that students are engaging in online learning as they should be. So what do we know about the effectiveness of distance learning? Back in March, when schools moved online, the Institute for Education Sciences screened about 300 studies that evaluated effectiveness of distance learning practices on student outcomes. Now, this does not necessarily mean that these studies were directly comparing in-person versus online learning. They were just looking at the effectiveness of some aspect of distance learning. In fact, the vast majority were not directly comparing distance learning versus in-person learning. But of these 300 studies, the vast majority were looking at college-age samples. Fewer were looking at high school and middle school samples, and very few looked at elementary or pre-K samples. And so overall, what this is suggesting is really that we have very little research on distance learning at the K-12 level. Now, in terms of those experimental and quasi-experimental studies that did directly compare in-person versus online learning, there were 5 total studies, and all were performed at the college level, and all were looking at exam performance. So I'm going to ask that you type into your chat right now, if you have the ability to do so, how many studies you think out of those 5 total, how many studies do you think found that in-person learning resulted in better exam performance? So again, out of those 5 studies, type in your chat how many you think found that in-person learning resulted in better exam performance. And John or Liz, I don't know if you can report out maybe on the most commonly guessed number.
It's a pretty good smattering. I see a lot of 5s and a lot of 4s.
The answer is actually 1. So there was only 1 of those 5 studies that found that in-person learning resulted in better exam performance. 1 found that online learning resulted in better exam performance, and the rest found that there were actually no differences between in-person versus online platforms in terms of exam performance. However, there was 1 study that found that students who received their instruction online turned in fewer assignments. Now, in terms of that 1 study that did find that there were differences for in-person learning, that Keefe study, they found that that was due to the discussion that ensued in the classroom. So in other words, the instructor was engaging students in discussion about the material in the classroom, but not online. And so they conducted some follow-up studies and found that it's really, really important, if you are engaging in online learning, to help mitigate any differences, to include some sort of discussion component of the material online. Now, in terms of research on hybrid classrooms, 1 study, now hybrid classrooms, these are the classrooms where students are attending in class for part of the week, and they are attending online for the other part of the week. And so 1 study found that there were no differences in exam performance, but another study that was conducted more recently found that although there were no differences in homework performance on the days that students did versus did not attend in person, there were differences on a few other components. So they found overall that students tended to do better on post-lesson questions that were asked in person versus the ones that were asked online. That effect, though, was small. They did find a larger effect for specific exam questions. So specifically, students did better on exam questions that corresponded with the lessons where they received in-person instruction. So overall, what this is suggesting is that we really have a variety of outcomes that we're seeing with in-person versus online learning. So it's really difficult to gauge the effectiveness of these 2 methods when we directly compare them. And again, it's important to remember that these were all conducted at the college level, so the extent to which these apply down to the K-12 level is not really known. Now, if we go back down to the K-12 level, 1 variable or 1 key skill that we know is really important for students' ability to participate in any type of online learning is typing. And if we think about what we know about typing versus handwriting in schools, 85% of tasks require handwriting versus typing. So students aren't getting a whole lot of practice with typing in typical classroom settings. I have had some schools that ask me, is it really worth it for us to continue teaching handwriting? Should we just move to iPads or to typing instead, since students seem to be doing more of that? And the answer is that although students seem to be doing more of that at home, there are a lot of benefits, both cognitively and neuropsychologically, to teaching handwriting. So specifically, teaching handwriting helps students solidify memory, and it also helps with this neuropsychological phenomenon that we call proprioception. So this ability to get feedback from your physical environment to know where you are in space. Handwriting continues to be important even at the college level. We know that the speed and quantity of handwritten notes is actually one of the strongest predictors of exam performance. So that means that the amount of notes that students take while teachers are talking and how quickly they can take them while teachers are talking, this tells us a lot about how they're going to perform on their exams at the college level. Now, in terms of typing, we know that broadly, nationwide, there is little explicit instruction that tends to be done in typing in the school setting. And this, though, is despite the fact that we know students tend to perform better with their typing skills when they are given explicit instruction in typing, as with handwriting. We also know that introducing typing to writing tasks actually widens the gap between weak writers and strong writers. So what that means is that when you introduce typing, the strong writers get even better with their writing when they type, and the weak writers get even worse with their writing skills when they're typing. There's some correlational data too to suggest that students tend to type faster than when they handwrite, but we really don't have a lot of research on this across broad levels, particularly at the elementary level, and we actually don't have any direct experimental studies directly comparing the effects of handwriting versus typing on writing speed. So this is actually something that my colleague and I are going to be looking at in the upcoming year, since this will be so important. Okay, so far, we know that school is being offered in a variety of formats, and we know that among other challenges, this mass exodus of experienced teachers is one of the many reasons why it's unclear whether in-person instruction will be as effective this year as we would typically expect in years past. We also know that there's very little research on K-12 online or hybrid instruction, but that for college students, those results are pretty mixed. Again, we also know that K-12 students might lack the necessary typing skills that they need to effectively participate in online instruction. So it's difficult to assess what the impact of this educational instability will be down the road for these students. But the American Academy of Pediatrics has looked at a number of correlates of academic skill. And what they've found is that academic skills deficits are associated with earlier onset of chronic disease, poorer socioeconomic factors, including occupational status, income, the neighborhood that individuals end up living in down the road, their wealth. It's also associated with engaging in a variety of risky behaviors as well. And so this has really led the American Academy of Pediatrics to determine that academic skills are one of the fundamental determinants of health, and that the racial gap in education is a primary contributor to racial disparities in mortality. And so really, even this group of pediatricians considers education to be as important to individuals' long-term health outcomes as healthcare is. So because of this, it's really important that we identify some key effective practices to help support student learning during this time. And no matter what type of instruction that students are engaged in, whether it be online learning or in classroom or hybrid, we know how skills develop. We have a pretty good understanding from a behavioral perspective of how skills develop and how we can use our instructional practices at each point of skill development to help this growth along. And so we know that it's really important when we're first introducing a skill to simply help the student gain accuracy with the skill. So it doesn't matter how quickly they do it, it just matters that they can do it accurately. When we give them this task over and over again, that they can perform it with about 90 to 100% accuracy. And the reason that that's so important, that accuracy piece, is because then that next step of skill development is what from a cognitive lens we call automaticity, and from a behavioral lens we call fluency. This idea basically that you can perform a skill automatically without spending a lot of time thinking about how to do it. You can just do it automatically because you're so fluent or automatic at it. And the reason that that is so important is because, again, there are two different lenses from which you can look at it. From a cognitive lens, the reason that matters is because if we can perform a skill automatically, then that means that our cognitive powers are freed up to think about other things. So we can think about, for example, how to apply it to other contexts rather than spending so much time about thinking about how to do it to begin with. From a behavioral lens, the reason that developing automaticity or fluency is so important is because that helps students be able to generalize that skill. Again, they're not spending a lot of time having to think about how to do it. They can better generalize that. So thinking about how to help students generalize skills to new contexts and use them in new ways, that's sort of at the heart of my research. That typically is the goal of all education, is to get students to be able to generalize their skills. And so I do a lot of, my research looks at that quite a bit. Importantly, this behavioral model of skill development is something that can apply to any skill that can be operationalized as a behavior. So this can apply to reading, writing, math. It can apply to learning how to cook, learning how to ride a bike, learning how to drive a car. Any skill that can be operationalized as a behavior. John Hattie is a researcher who looks at instructional practices that have the strongest effects on student outcomes. And he has synthesized over 800 meta-analyses, which just blows my mind because meta-analyses are already synthesizing a whole lot of studies. And so based on outcomes of over 8 million students, he's operationalized the effects of a variety of different instructional practices on student outcomes as either having no effect, a small effect, a medium effect, or a large effect. And one of the most important things we can do is ensure that students have fluency with prerequisite skills before we start teaching them new skills. So that means that if a student hasn't developed real fluency with something, don't just move them on, make sure they develop fluency with that first. Discussion produces a large effect on student outcomes, as does providing repeated practice, again, so they can become fluent. Providing performance feedback, so ensuring that students know exactly how they're doing relative to a goal is important, as is providing instruction in an explicit manner, so making sure we show them how to do a skill, give them opportunities to practice and provide performance feedback. Now, interestingly, in this double meta-analysis, what John Hattie did look at was distance learning. And he found that of the studies available, there was no discernible effect of whether education was provided in a distance format or not. And so, again, that may be because there are so many disparate findings in that area. But I know there might be some teachers on the call, and so I did want to provide this resource for any teachers. This visible learning book is really useful, and it describes a lot of those variables. I also wanted to provide some tips for parents and caregivers. I won't go through all of these, but one of my students, Emily Carey, in our school psychology program, when everything went remote back in March, she did a really good job making these tip sheets for parents and caregivers around evidence-based practices for encouraging compliance with online learning. We know that was a real challenge for many parents. And so I think Liz and John are going to drop that in the chat for you so that if there are any parents on the call, you can download that and hopefully it'll be helpful. But I wanted to end on a positive note because I know that was a lot of doom and gloom to say that we don't exactly know if in-person learning will be effective this year. We don't know whether distance learning will be effective this year, but education is vitally important to students' health. So on a positive note, I think it's important to end with this idea that children are resilient. We know that from the research literature. We know that if students have any one single of these protective factors in effect, as long as we nurture that, students will hold on to that and be pretty resilient. So I will go ahead and open it up to questions. John, I'm not sure if there are specific rules around asking.
Yeah, thanks, Bridget. That was great. Yes, so we are going to do some Q&A now. We have about 32 minutes left. You can type your question for Professor Hier into the chat and I will dictate that to her. You can also raise your hand and let us know if you would like to ask a question and I can call on you, and you can unmute yourself and you will be able to speak your question directly. So please go ahead and type your questions into the chat or raise your hand. So we have a couple coming in on the chat, so I'll start there. Lena asked if you could also show the resiliency page again. So let's do that before we're done. Andrew has a question. What is normal teacher exodus? So you talked about exodus during this unusual time. What is the normal rate?
Yeah, that's a really good question, especially because I showed it for two different areas, right? So I showed it for Michigan and then I showed it nationally. I'm not sure what it is for Michigan, but I was doing some research into what that is nationally. And it looks like nationally that's typically below about 5% was what I was reading, although that was not necessarily the most reliable source where I found that. But what I was reading was about 5% or below.
Okay, great, thanks. Other questions? We also have a nice comment from someone saying helpful and inspiring, thank you. So that's great, thank you. We appreciate that.
I'm glad that that was inspiring and not too doom and gloom.
No, I think you balance things out nicely. Okay, we have another question. Do you have any advice from a psychological point of view to make a 5-year-old or young student, say K through 3, feel excited and engaged in a virtual environment, or at least psychologically safe? And that's from Lena.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Lena. And I think it depends if you're thinking about that either from a teacher perspective or from a parent or caregiver perspective. From a parent or caregiver perspective, one thing that is really important to do, well, I think this is important for both teachers and parents. One thing that's really important to do is to provide a lot of explicit expectations ahead of time so that students know what's coming. Clearly delineating, okay, here's what this is going to look like. Here's what you're expected to do during this time. Here, let's practice. Let's pretend that we're doing it. So you be the student, I'll be the teacher. Here's what you need to do during this time. And then providing a lot of praise, not praise that just says good job, not just telling the student that you're a really good student for doing this. You want to engage in what we call behavior specific praise. So that means you don't praise the person, you praise the behavior or the effort. So clearly identify the behavior that they're engaging in. that you want to see them do again, and say, oh my gosh, Johnny, you are doing a great job sitting quietly and listening while your teacher is talking, or you're doing a great job sitting at the kitchen table and working on your work, whatever it is that you can praise over and over again. You can also have the student engage in online learning in short chunks of time, and break it up with fun activities, provided that they actually do what is expected during that time, and then clearly link the fun activity to you're getting this because you engaged in your online learning.
Great, thanks, Bridget. We have a couple questions about the social and emotional impacts of the transition to distance or remote learning on K through 12 students. So can you speak to that? Is that within your realm of expertise?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's more in the realm of my colleague Josh Felver's expertise. He's another.
We'll have to do another Alumni Academy with him then.
Yeah, I know you will. But I think what he would say is that certainly having other individuals around, having peers around is incredibly important for kids, right? To be able to practice their social skills. But I think having consistency, having a set schedule, those are really important pieces to help promote that social emotional development as well. Okay,
Steve asked, he's an instructional coach supporting teachers with a varying level of comfort with tech. Does the key instructional practices apply to adults as well as young learners?
That's a great question. Yes, it does. So these have been looked at widely for all the way from pre-K all the way up until adult learning, even late adult learning. So yes, they do.
Great. We've had a couple people ask if we can make the slides available. Are you okay with sharing your slides? Great. So I'm going to type an email address into the chat right now. And if you would like the slides, send an email to that address requesting them, and we'll make sure you get them. That's the best way for us to get them to you. Let's see. Next question about any good resources for high school age students. Andrew says, and he says, it seems like there are hundreds of companies out there selling services.
Yeah, that's another good question. And I think that goes back to that question of, do these strategies apply even to adult learners? And the answer is yes there. The answer is also yes for high schoolers. But the issue is that with high schoolers, you need to, and with adult learners, you need to implement these in more of a savvy way, right? So you can't just say, oh, good job with your online learning. But, you know, for example, praise can be delivered in more of a thank you type way. Thanks for doing this. I appreciate this. But all of those things are still important. We know that even at the high school level, providing explicit instruction in expected behavior is just as important as it is at the elementary school level. So really all of these resources, including the parent resources that I mentioned my student developed, those can apply. You just have to think more about the population level.
Okay, next, Becca had a question. Any tips related to summer slide and how to make up what seems to be an even bigger slide this year? She says she feels like her children, 12 and 14, are easily frustrated when she asks about doing review before school starts.
Oh yeah, I empathize with her for sure for asking that question. This gets me thinking about this concept that we call behavioral maintenance. So the idea is that once you learn a skill, you need to continue receiving some type of reinforcement for that skill and repeated practice of that skill now and then to maintain it over time. And summer slide is such a real thing. I did a study, oh gosh, several years ago now, and found that providing periodic practice on whatever type of behavior it is that the individual is learning. So providing repeated practice but on varied materials is really important. So just mixing it up, making it fun as much as you can. And again, the key is to make sure that the individual or the child can perform it correctly to begin with, so that when they practice, they're doing it correctly. They're not practicing the wrong way over and over again.
Great. Nicole asks, do you see any opportunities that are arising with the teacher exodus this year or with other changes happening regarding credential requirements?
Oh, that's a good question. And actually that gets more into that policy realm that I just don't have as much expertise with, unfortunately. So I'm not going to be able to answer that as well as some of my colleagues in the School of Education probably would be.
Thank you. Okay, Jessica asked, if school is going to be 100% online or even hybrid for younger kids K through 5, do you think there will be issues with connections to the teacher? Children use their teachers as an authority figure. If they have no emotional connection to them, what makes them want to follow their rules?
Such a good question. And I wish I could say I was only worried about that at the K-12 level. I'm going to be providing my instruction to college students, graduate students, all online this year. And I am terrified of that myself, not really with the rule following, because I don't worry about that so much with grad students. But I definitely worry about that emotional connection piece, absolutely. And so that's why I think it's important when we go back to that discussion piece, if teachers can think about any way to even reach out to students individually. That's so much harder, again, for K-12 teachers. But doing something like, I don't know, having like an open Zoom time where students can pop into your virtual Zoom office to just chat and say hello, and talk and get to know each other. Those types of things might be really important during this time. Just again, you're right, so that there is some type of social connection. I guess related to that too, making sure that there's a link, a home to school link, so some sort of connection between the parent and the teacher or the caregiver and the teacher this year, I think is going to be more important than ever.
Okay. A question. Oh, yes. So someone asked, so I posted the email address to request a copy of the slides. You can also use that to request a link to the recording. We're going to be posting this on our YouTube channel. Liz, maybe you can drop the address to our YouTube channel into the chat as well so people can go there. But Sandy, we'll make sure that you get a copy so that you can watch this later. Kim had a question. Kim asked, how are special needs students doing with online learning? Do they need additional support? And if so, what suggestions do you have to make it easier?
Yes, that is a very good question. As a researcher in the field of school psychology, I would have to say right now, that is the one main thing keeping me up at night, is thinking about what is going to happen with this generation of students with special needs. That is something I'm deeply concerned about, because typically students with special needs, by definition, need more support during in-person learning. They may have needs that are so significant that a parent or caregiver can't necessarily manage those when it intersects with education. That's something that actually teachers receive specialized education in themselves to become special education teachers. So in thinking about that, it's not necessarily that students with special needs always need different types of instruction, but they might need more intensive types of what we know is effective for most students. So for example, when I say practice, 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 that is tenfold for individuals with learning disabilities. So practice, 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 practice with a lot of performance feedback, meaning tell them quickly and consistently what they're doing right and what they're doing well with, and quickly correct any errors. That's key. Again, making sure that before you engage in any practice with them, that they reach that 90 to 100% accuracy benchmark with the skill, so that they're not over practicing making mistakes.
Okay, Angela had a question. Do you have any comments on the psychological / emotional / mental effects of young students doing social distancing and mask wearing in a school setting? She says her daughter's going into 2nd grade and so much of her school is working with others, socializing with friends and classmates, etc. What are the effects of that going to be with the masking and the distancing?
Yeah, it's so hard to know because right now we really don't have any research in that realm right now. But I think it's going to be really challenging, particularly for younger students, although I would argue even for older students as well. I guess I would think about it from this standpoint. If we are expecting these behaviors to occur, then we need to explicitly teach students how to engage in social behaviors with mask wearing. For example, when is it appropriate to take off your mask versus when isn't it? How do you engage in social interaction with students and your peers and your teachers and your parents during this time? So again, it all comes back to that explicit instruction, telling students what they're doing well. But I hear that question from parents who are absolutely concerned about even things like, if a child's face is covered up and they have to be 6 feet from other students, are they going to develop social skills typically as they would during other times? A different colleague of mine in the area of social psychology actually does a lot of research, not necessarily with children, but with college-age students around the effects of physical touch. And we know that typically having some type of physical touch in I shouldn't say any type of relationship, in friend relationships is really important. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how this generation of students develops, depending on, how long these protocols are in place. As well as the age that they are currently. So in other words, will younger students have differential effects than older students?
Bridget, I have a question. What effect is COVID having on your research? Presumably you do clinical research, and have you had to just stop? And when do you think you can get back on track?
That is a very good practical question. Yeah. Yeah, so I had a really large grant-funded study that was about to start up across 3 different school districts. I think we had 16 different schools on board with 60 teachers and classrooms participating. So it was literally the same week that oh gosh, my poor graduate student coordinated all of our schedules with that of 60 teachers to go in and do longitudinal data collection, and the university shut down. So as a result, we had to shut down the project, and of course then the schools all closed just a few weeks later. So really right now, we're holding, teachers have so much on their plates right now. We don't want to add an additional burden because we do all of our research in the schools. So when I talk about my research lab, my lab is literally in the schools. So we're just sort of in a holding pattern right now, working with previous data.
Seems unfortunate because this presents such an opportunity for you to study this. And as you pointed out earlier, there's not a lot of research on this area.
Yeah, it's true. We are thinking about a couple of things that we can do remotely, particularly as it applies to typing. So essentially all previously thought out studies those are definitely on hold right now, but it has presented an opportunity for us to think a little bit more about, well, how can we make some of these things work online? So for example, a colleague of mine is actually replicating an intervention study that was developed here at Syracuse. So he's at the University of Iowa, and he's taking one of our one of our writing interventions, and he's going to apply that in an online format and see if that's effective in that format.
Terrific. Okay, we've got a few more minutes left. If there are any more questions, we'd be happy to get those in. I know, Bridget, you're probably very busy right now. Classes start on Monday. And I imagine you've got a lot going on right now. So I don't think I see any more questions coming in. So I want to first thank you, Professor Hier. Oh, wait, one quick question. Okay, then, any data regarding homeschooling effectiveness? And is any of that applicable to the current situation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes, homeschool can certainly be effective in there. Again, these learning strategies that we talked about, they're not necessarily different depending upon where the learning is carried out, whether it be at home or in school. The difference, though, is that with homeschooling, so many kids are being sort of homeschooled right now. The difference is those whose parents had already been homeschooling them is that they sort of signed up to be teachers to begin with, where many parents right now are having to do a lot of that teaching and didn't necessarily sign up for that. So it's a lot trickier to just, simply apply those strategies.
Yeah. Okay. And I think this will be our last question. Anna asked, and I think you spoke to this, is data being collected this year to help evaluate the impacts of distance learning on K-12? It sounds like there are efforts to do that, but they have to be done remotely.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I think, so the Institute for Education Sciences fund, that's through the U.S. Department of Education, they provide a lot of funding for education studies. And so my assumption is that there will be likely this year some large scale studies that will probably be looking at the effectiveness of distance versus online learning.
Okay. All right, good. Well, Professor Hier, thank you so much for taking time and to do this with us today. It was really good. I learned a lot. I've got young kids, so I really appreciated it. And also want to thank everybody who joined us today. We really appreciate you joining us. We will be posting this on our YouTube channel. You've got the email if you want to send a request for anything, we can do that. And keep an eye out. We'll be doing more of these types of events over the course of the semester, covering all kinds of topics in the sciences, social sciences, humanities, and we look forward to seeing you at one of those. So take care and thank you. We'll see you soon.